Hey everyone, JL here, and welcome back to Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that follow, and how we can mend the societal divisions that they create. Today, we're going to take a look at the YouTube channel By the Book Ministries. Thanks go out to Simon Dan for introducing me to this channel when he handily debunked one of their Young Earth creationist videos. After watching that, I figured I'd take a look at the channel and see if there was something else they got categorically wrong. And believe me, I wasn't disappointed. I discovered that underneath its shiny, Jesus-coated exterior, there is a veritable panoply of silly, deceptive, and outright dangerous thought within. Run by Southern Baptist Pastor Frederick Clement Sr., formerly of the now permanently closed Meadowdale Baptist Church in Ohio, the channel's goal, as stated in its About tab, is to give instructional, Bible-based videos covering many different topics, biblical commentary, and reactions to popular figures, events, and trends that seeks to infiltrate the church, and a strong proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And yes, the slightly paranoid statement, seeks to infiltrate the church, was a bit of a red flag. Now, while there are many topics on the channel that I could easily take a swing at, such as Pray Like a Pro, 5 helpful tips for new believers, how to read the Bible in 2020, is smoking weed a sin? And 7 tips to rekindle your love for Jesus. I decided that all of these were just low-hanging fruit. Pray like a pro? It's a subjective experience that you can't really, with any honesty, dictate to others, Fred. Unless, of course, you're a praying mantis. They're the authority. How to read the Bible? Biblical interpretation is subjective as well. How did you determine that your hermeneutics were valid over anybody else's? Smoking weed a sin? And how exactly did you determine God's position on the stickiest of the icky? 7 tips to rekindle love for Jesus? Oh, it's not you, it's me. I just find it really hard to be into someone who doesn't exist. What I ultimately decided to tackle was a video on the Epicurean problem of evil, something that the Fredster here gets fantastically wrong.
Hey guys, Pastor Frederick here, back with another video. I'm up at the church today and I'm getting some things ready for this week, but I wanted to talk to you guys about evil, the problem of evil.
The problem of evil, also known as the Epicurean paradox, the riddle of Epicurus and Epicurus's trilemma, was a question of how to reconcile the existence of evil and suffering with an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God. Its presentation is attributed to Greek philosopher Epicurus, with Scottish philosopher David Hume popularizing it in the mid-1700s.
Now, if you ever had a conversation with an atheist or an agnostic or someone who doesn't believe in God, there's many questions that they would ask. And one of the main questions that I get asked is, why does God allow evil to exist? If God is an all-loving, omnipotent God, doesn't he have the capacity, the power to stop evil? And if he's loving, why is he allowing evil? Shouldn't that make God upset to see evil persist in the world?
Firstly, the problem of evil is not mutually exclusive to agnostics and atheists. Theists of all stripes have struggled with this particular question since it was first presented. Secondly, they ask it because it's an excellent question. If the omni-God exists, a being that by definition would dictate universal necessity, then how is it that evil and suffering exist, when that omni-God could simply actualize a world in which evil and suffering are not necessary?
And typically those conversations seem to, they derail at that point because they just don't want to engage any further in the conversation.
This is just wholesale dishonesty, with what I suspect is a hint of projection. With concern to Fred's followers, what he's doing here is poisoning the well. He's subtly claiming that non-believers will simply derail the conversation because they're not interested in engaging beyond the merely asserting that there is a problem. The ultimate goal here is to warn off believers from ever engaging with non-believers because of the baseless assertion that the non-believers are just going to be dishonest.
And it's hard to come up with a concise answer in that moment. So today I want to just help you think through the problem of evil.
Yeah, I would imagine it'd be difficult to answer when just put on the spot. So, let's see if Fred here actually addresses the problem of evil and instructs his followers on how to respond to it honestly. Call me a cynic, I predict he won't.
the problem doesn't consist on the Christian side.
Consist on the side of? Exist on the side of? Meh. What's grammar when you're discussing the philosophical dilemmas and the paradoxical entailments of your theistic worldview?
The problem really lays on the atheist side.
Incorrect. The problem is presented by an atheist to a theist as an internal critique of their belief system. So no, the problem exists firmly in the theist camp.
Because if there is no God, what is evil in an atheistic framework? If there is no moral lawgiver, there is no objective standard of right or wrong.
This is misleading. If God is defined as the moral standard, then yes, God is the moral standard. But just because you define a concept a certain way doesn't make it real. And if God as the moral standard exists, then any moral standard would be subjective to God, as God could arbitrarily alter the moral standard on some personal whim. Believing that it wouldn't do this is just an appeal to emotion, and believing that it couldn't do this entails that God's not all-powerful. Now, if God doesn't exist, that means moral standards fall to us to implement, which we do. And they've taken the form of the arbitrary laws that have governed the various societies humans have lived in for the past 5,000 years. Arbitrary laws derived from a singular goal: to survive. So regardless of whether or not the omnipotent God exists, we can see that all moral standards are in fact subjective to the authority that implements them.
Suffering and death is a natural process.
Death is a natural process, yes. Suffering, however, can be divided into two categories: necessary suffering and unnecessary suffering. When I hunt an animal for food, the hopefully brief suffering that I impose upon it to achieve the goal of feeding myself is necessary. This can be reconciled with the existence of a God. But when a child dies, an excruciating death from bone cancer, that is wholly unnecessary. This is irreconcilable with the existence of such a being, especially if this particular definition of that being is accurate. In point of fact, this type of suffering is only natural if such a God does not exist.
It's nothing evil about that. Think about it. In order for evil to exist, there has to be an objective moral standard of right or wrong.
Incorrect. Just like the word good, the word evil is an arbitrary term used to describe a consequence of a particular action. This just means that what is good and what is evil are defined by the individual or the society at the time. And just as stated before concerning moral standards, if God is omnipotent, that would mean what is evil is subjective to God, and so on and so forth.
If there is no standard of good, we wouldn't be able to recognize evil.
There is a standard. It is set by us. That's how we recognize the difference.
Just like if there was no light, we wouldn't be able to recognize darkness. Darkness would be all around us constantly. We wouldn't know the difference.
This is a false equivalence. Good and evil are abstract concepts. Light and dark demonstrably exist. Fred's fallacious reasoning here is based upon the notion that you cannot understand a thing without the presence of its opposite. Unfortunately, even the concept of opposites is entirely a subjective interpretation of the differences between two things. Ask yourself if a red apple is the opposite of a green apple. Is it the opposite of an orange? How about a can of Diet Coke? While there are arbitrary boundaries that most people agree upon, it really comes down to how you feel.
The existence of evil presupposes the existence of a objective moral standard.
Absolutely incorrect. Evil is an arbitrary term that describes consequences that we have personally or societally agreed upon as being undesired. Claiming something to be evil presupposes nothing, Fred. However, claiming that it does is just a projection of your own presupposition that God exists.
Evil doesn't exist in atheism.
Yes, it does. We just believe that what we define as evil is subjective to us instead of to a God.
So whenever an atheist says evil exists, therefore, ... that atheist has just abandoned his own worldview and stepped into our worldview.
This is a common claim of many presuppositionalists, that atheists have to either borrow or hijack the Christian worldview in order to make sense of their own, which is patently absurd. Just because precept Christians define their God in a particular way does not mean they've cornered the market on what is good and evil. Precepts think they've done this because they presuppose their God exists, which of course is just begging the question.
I mean, Richard Dawkins said, there is no right or wrong, good or evil, just blind, pitiless indifference, right? He understands that.
Now, this was weird because the Fredster only used half of the quote that he posted in the video. Dawkins made this statement in the context of the universe that we observe. His conclusion is based upon the logical entailments that come with the existence of an omni-God. If the omni-God exists, we would observe a universe that reflects this, but we do not observe such a universe, so it logically follows that the omni-God does not exist. And by the way, Fred, if you're going to quote mine, be certain that you don't misrepresent the source by ignoring the context in which they were speaking.
So why is evil not a problem? Well, God is sovereign. He has a purpose for evil. Evil exists to point us towards Jesus Christ to save us.
This is a theist canard. All Fred has stated here is that God created evil as a tool to direct humanity towards Christ. But he still hasn't addressed the logical entailment that in the face of an omnipotent and omniscient entity, all necessity, tests, learning, and experience are completely arbitrary. The omni-God could have simply created us in the state that it wants us to end up in. No suffering or evil necessary, and yet still we observe unnecessary suffering and evil.
I find it so ironic that people who don't believe in God have a problem with evil. They're showing that they have a moral compass, they have a conscience that only God could give.
The assertion that only God can provide a moral compass is just an argument from incredulity. In Fred's mind, morality can only exist because it comes from God. Yet we understand through fields such as evolutionary game theory that humans learned very early on that cooperative action yields positive results long term as opposed to selfish actions. As a species, we figured out that if everyone was a selfish asshole, our species wouldn't last long. We want to survive. We want to live. So it behooves us to employ a set of rules that support that long-term goal and inhibit the effects of those who would consistently break those rules. But because surviving and how you survive are two different things, the rules we implement to support the goal are completely arbitrary, and they adapt and evolve, just as societies adapt and evolve. This has been demonstrated from the Sumerians all the way to modern America.
If there was no God, why would we care about evil?
Because we define evil as that which negatively impacts the health, happiness, and well-being of our society. All things that would support our long-term survivability.
In the animal kingdom, when things die, it's just a part of nature, right? But in the human race, there is a problem, a real problem with evil, right? Evil exists to show God's marvelous grace.
Yes, when things die, it's a part of nature. The same applies to human beings. Death is as natural as birth. And there only exists a problem of evil if an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God exists. But hang on a second. You said God created evil to direct humanity towards Jesus. Now you say God created evil to show us its grace? That doesn't follow at all. Why wouldn't God just show us his grace and cut out the evil? Why the narcissistic need to force us to our knees in confused and terrified desperation before granting us its grace? Remember, Fred, all necessity, tests, learning, experience are completely arbitrary in the face of the omni-God. So either the omni-God doesn't exist, or it's a narcissistic sadist forcing upon us the evil and unnecessary suffering that it created.
To save evil sinners.
But if God exists, evil only exists because God created it. And sin only exists because God declared something to be sin. It could have created it another way, but chose not to. Hence why the problem of evil exists in the first place.
Right? We wouldn't know God was gracious if there was no evil.
Sure we would. It could just make us with that knowledge baked in.
You know, evil exists in all of our hearts.
No, this is yet another theist canard. All humans have the capacity to commit behaviors that another human would consider to be evil. It is the subjective nature of this abstract concept that allows us to compartmentalize certain acts that we commit, such as in the course of self-defense, law enforcement, and warfare. But claiming that all humans have evil in them is just the theist trope of inventing the problem and then selling you the solution. By claiming you are broken and only God can fix you, they prey upon your fear and ignorance to gain access to your trust and your wallet.
Yet for those who are saved, we're overwhelmed by God's grace towards us, sinners.
Okay, Fred, please demonstrate God's grace towards you in comparison to the grace shown to children dying from AIDS in third world countries where missionaries preached against the use of contraception. I'll wait.
That he sent his only son to die while we were yet sinners. But evil also exists to show us that God is a just God and he will punish evil.
Once again, this is because all manner of necessity and judgment is arbitrary in the face of a being that is omniscient and omnipotent.
People say, why doesn't God stop evil? As if God is not stopping evil, or God has no plan to stop evil. God is going to stop evil. He may not stop it immediately, but he's going to stop it, and he's going to stop it permanently one day in the future.
This is just kicking the can out so far that it becomes impossible to answer the question. It's no different than espousing platitudes like God has a plan or God moves in mysterious ways. It's actually a tactic that theists use not to convert non-believers, but to reaffirm the faith of those believers having doubts.
So the next time an atheist asks you, why does God allow evil to exist? Ask that atheist, by what standard are you determining right from wrong?
And this is where Fred completely misunderstands the problem of evil. To ask the question is to first grant that the omni-God does in fact exist. The question is an attempt to reconcile the logical contradiction between the existence of evil and suffering and an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving creator. By baselessly asserting that atheists are applying an incorrect standard of good and evil to the question shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the issue at hand. If humans are made in God's image, and God itself is intelligible to humans, then it follows that God's standards of good and evil would be intelligible to humans. The paradox stands. But if God is not intelligible, and its standards are not our standards, then who could possibly assert beyond appeals to emotion what has and has not come from God? And, as you've stated in the past, that everything is evidence for God, then nothing is evidence for God, because there would be no means by which we can make that determination. This is a logical contradiction that must be addressed. Unfortunately, Fred here, along with many other theists, cannot get around it without begging the question or appealing to their own incredulity, ignorance, or emotion.
Without an objective standard, it is just their opinion and preference, and someone with a different opinion can have the same validity without an objective moral reference.
Fred never actually addresses the problem of evil. His advice to his followers is just to throw a perceived lack of objective moral standards back in the face of atheists, and to do so in the most dishonest way possible. And the reason Fred didn't actually address the problem of evil is because the only logical conclusions to it either entail that an omni-God doesn't exist, or that a narcissistic, sadistic creator does exist, and Christianity is predicated on a lie. Which is it going to be, Fred? And until he's able to answer, I'd strongly recommend that his followers not employ his tactics in dealing with the harder questions that some atheists and agnostics may pose to you. You will do yourself and your faith no benefit in the attempt when you presuppose that your opponent is automatically dishonest or deceptive. Better to open your ears and withhold judgment until you've listened to and understood everything they have to say. And incidentally, I actually asked Fredster the hermeneutics question in the comments of this video that we're looking at. He initially dodged and then just stated he's correct because he's correct. Tell me, Fred, do you get dizzy on that precept train? Thank you all so much for joining me for another edition of Bridge the Divide. I really hope you enjoyed this look at By the Book Ministries. I guarantee I'll be commenting on them again in the future. If you would like to see more from me, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and make sure you turn the bell on for notifications so you can get the latest updates and videos from the channel. On a lighter note, if you like scary movies, be sure to check out our podcast, Week in Horror, where me and my filmmaker friends deep dive the films of the horror genre. All the links you need are in the description. I'm JL, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and I'll see you next time.